In 1917, more than 2 million people fled the former Russian Empire. They did not leave behind a small political dispute. They left behind a country that had collapsed around them. Some crossed Europe. Others moved toward China, the Middle East, or the Americas. A smaller part of this enormous refugee movement reached Japan. And for some of those people, Kobe became the place where exile was supposed to become a new life. At its height, more than 400 White Russians lived in Kobe, particularly in the former Fukiai and Ikuta districts. More than 400 people. That number was small compared with the millions who had left Russia, but in a city where they had arrived as foreigners, it was large enough to create a recognizable community. They needed work. They needed homes. They needed churches, religious institutions, businesses, and places where people who had lost their country could still recognize something familiar. But there was a problem that no new home could completely solve. After 1925, White Russians in Japan were treated as stateless people. They could receive a Nansen Passport connected with the League of Nations. It could provide a form of identification, but it could not simply give them back the citizenship they had lost. You could have a document proving who you were without having a country that officially claimed you. That was the strange position of the Russian émigré in Kobe. And then, the community itself began to change. Before the Great Canton earthquake of 1923, most Russian émigrés in Japan lived around Tokyo and Yokohama. After the earthquake, a significant part of the Russian population moved toward Kobe. Kobe was a port city. It offered opportunities for trade and movement, and it became one of the principal centers of Russian émigré life in Japan. But the people grouped together as White Russians were not one simple, united population. They included Christians, Jews, and Muslim Tatars from the former Russian Empire. Their religious identities mattered. Their political views differed. Their relationship with the Soviet Union differed. Some worked in itinerant or small-scale trade. Some moved from place to place in search of customers and income. Japanese authorities watched the community closely, and some émigrés were suspected of connections with foreign states, especially the Soviet Union. In the 1920s, some White Russians were expelled from Japan. So the people who had already escaped one political catastrophe discovered that exile did not automatically mean safety. And there is a bitter irony here. They had escaped a revolution that had destroyed their old world. Yet in Kobe, they would still have to negotiate with governments, borders, documents, suspicion, poverty, war, and the question of whether a community could survive after the people who created it began to leave. The story of Kobe's White Russians was not the story of a colony that simply appeared and disappeared. It was the story of people trying to remain themselves while history repeatedly changed the conditions under which they were allowed to exist. And the first great change came not from a political decree, but from a disaster thousands of miles away from the Russia they had lost. To understand why Kobe became important to Russian émigrés, you have to begin with geography. Before 1923, the main concentration of Russian émigrés in Japan was around Tokyo and Yokohama. Then the Great Canton earthquake struck. The earthquake changed the distribution of Russian émigrés in Japan. After the disaster, a significant part of the community moved toward Kobe. This movement mattered because Kobe was not merely another Japanese city. It was a major port connected to international trade and movement. For people whose lives had become defined by borders, documents, and departures, a port could be both a refuge and a doorway. And then, Kobe began to develop its own Russian social world. At its peak, more than 400 White Russians lived there, particularly around the former Fukiai and Ikuta districts. But the label itself could hide the complexity of the population. White Russian did not mean that every person in Kobe had the same religious background, the same politics, or even the same relationship with Russian identity. Christians, Jews, and Muslim Tatars were all included within the broad category used by the Japanese authorities. That meant community life could develop through religious institutions as well as through shared language and origin. The surviving physical traces tell part of the story. The Kobe Eastern Orthodox Church Assumption of the Blessed Virgin, the Kobe Muslim Mosque, and the Kobe Foreign Cemetery remained associated with the former Russian presence. These places matter because exile is not only a political condition. It leaves buildings. It leaves graves. It leaves religious institutions. It leaves streets where people once lived. But buildings can survive longer than communities. The people themselves still needed to make a living. Many Russian émigrés in Kobe worked in small-scale or itinerant trade. This was not the stable professional life that someone from the old imperial social order might once have expected. The émigré world had forced people into practical decisions. A person could no longer simply ask what position he or she had held before 1917. The question was now, what can you do here today to survive? At the same time, the Japanese authorities did not view the community as completely harmless or politically neutral. Some white Russians were suspected of having connections with foreign states, particularly the Soviet Union. The result was an atmosphere in which legal status and political suspicion could overlap. After 1925, the white Russians in Japan were treated as stateless. The Nansen Passport offered an international form of identification, but it did not erase the underlying problem. You could be recognized as a person and still remain politically displaced. And in the 1920s, some white Russians were expelled from Japan. That fact changes the way we should look at Kobe. It was a refuge, but not an unconditional refuge. It was a place where a community could form, but not a guarantee that the community would remain untouched by the political pressures of the era. The Russian émigrés had escaped the collapse of the old empire. Now, they had to learn how to survive without the protection of a state of their own. The turning point in this story is not a single battle or a dramatic speech. It is the gradual transformation of exile into permanent uncertainty. By 1925, the legal position of white Russians in Japan had become fundamentally different from the position of ordinary citizens. They were treated as stateless. That single word carried enormous consequences. Stateless meant that the country you once belonged to no longer provided the normal political framework of citizenship. A Nansen Passport could give you a recognized identity document connected to the League of Nations. But it could not recreate the Russian Empire. It could not restore the political world that had disappeared after 1917. And then, suspicion became another part of daily life. Russian émigrés in Kobe were watched by Japanese authorities. Some were suspected of connections with foreign countries, especially the Soviet Union. For people who had already crossed a political frontier, this created an uncomfortable contradiction. They were refugees from revolutionary Russia, yet they could still be treated as a potential political problem in their new country. Some white Russians were expelled from Japan during the 1920s. We should be careful here. The surviving research does not provide enough verified information in the available material to reconstruct each individual expulsion with a name, exact date, and personal testimony. So we should not invent one. But the larger fact is clear. Refugee status did not guarantee permanent residence. The community therefore existed under a condition that was difficult to escape. It could grow. It could build institutions. It could develop businesses. But its members remained vulnerable to decisions made by authorities. This is where the story becomes more complicated than the simple image of white Russians in exile. There was no single white Russian political identity. The community included Christians, Jews, and Muslim Tatars. Its members had different relationships with the Soviet Union. Some developed stronger nationalist attitudes during the 1930s. Some representatives of the community even donated to the Japanese government and military. That is one of the most striking changes in the story. People who had fled the political transformation of Russia were now living inside another country whose own political direction was changing rapidly. And some members of the émigré community adapted to that environment. The question was no longer simply, where is Russia? It became, what does loyalty mean when you have no state of your own? That question had no universal answer. Some émigrés could preserve their Russian identity through religion and community institutions. Others had to focus on commerce and survival. Others adapted more closely to the society around them. And still others eventually left Japan altogether. The community was therefore being pulled in several directions at once. And this is the point at which the story stops being simply about refugees arriving in Kobe. It becomes a story about what happens when refugees stay long enough to become a community, and then discover that even a community can disappear. Imagine arriving in Kobe after losing the political world you once knew. You have crossed borders. You may have lost property, status, and security. Now you have to build a daily life from whatever remains. For the Russian émigrés of Kobe, work became one of the foundations of that life. Many were involved in itinerant or small-scale trade. This detail is easy to overlook because it sounds ordinary, but it tells you something important. The old social categories of the Russian Empire did not automatically survive exile. A person's previous position did not guarantee the same position in Kobe. The émigré community had to function inside a new economy. Trade could mean movement. Movement could mean uncertainty. And uncertainty was already a familiar part of refugee life. The same people who needed income also had to live under a complicated legal status. After 1925, white Russians were treated as stateless in Japan. The Nansen Passport could provide identification, but it could not turn statelessness into citizenship. That distinction is central to the story. A passport normally suggests freedom of movement and membership in a country. The Nansen document represented something different. It was an international answer to a population that had fallen outside the normal citizenship system. In Kobe, this status existed alongside another reality: surveillance. Japanese authorities watched the Russian émigré population closely. Some people were suspected of connections with foreign states, especially the Soviet Union. This did not mean that every white Russian was a political agent. The community was too diverse for such a claim. But suspicion itself could affect how a refugee was treated. And then, some people were expelled from Japan during the 1920s. For a person who had already lost one homeland, expulsion could mean another forced departure. This is why the story of Kobe cannot be reduced to nostalgia. There were Russian churches. There was a mosque. There was a foreign cemetery. There were neighborhoods where hundreds of émigrés lived. But alongside these visible signs of community stood an invisible fragility. The community depended on people who could remain. It depended on families who would stay. It depended on institutions that could continue operating. And it depended on younger generations seeing a reason to preserve the identity of their parents. The research available to us does not provide enough verified individual biographies to safely tell a dramatic story about one specific shopkeeper, taxi driver, seamstress, or soldier. That is important. A documentary should never create a human tragedy simply because the script needs one. So instead, the human story has to be reconstructed from what the evidence actually shows. Hundreds of people were living in Kobe after the upheavals of the Russian Revolution and the earthquake in Japan. They were working, they were worshiping, they were trading, they were raising families, and they were trying to create continuity. But continuity is difficult when the legal identity of an entire community is uncertain. And the longer the émigrés remained in Japan, the more the political world around them changed. By the 1930s, the question of survival would become entangled with nationalism, Japan's wartime environment, and the increasingly complicated relationship between Russia, Japan, and the Soviet Union. By the 1930s, the Russian émigré community in Kobe was no longer simply a group of people waiting for a return that might never come. Time had changed the meaning of exile. The people who had arrived after the collapse of the Russian Empire had now spent years outside their former country. Some were adapting to Japan. Some were building stronger nationalist identities. And some representatives of the white Russian community made donations to the Japanese government and military. There's a bitter irony here. People who had escaped revolutionary Russia were now living in a Japan whose own political environment was becoming increasingly nationalist. The community had to navigate that environment, but it would be wrong to imagine that every white Russian in Kobe thought alike. The research shows disagreements within the émigré population over the Soviet Union. That matters because the phrase white Russian can create the illusion of a perfectly unified political movement. It was not. The people living under that label came from different backgrounds. They included Christians, Jews, and Muslim Tatars. Their religious institutions differed. Their political opinions differed. Their relationship with the Soviet Union differed, and their plans for the future differed. Some may have imagined eventual return. Others looked toward permanent life outside Russia. Others had already begun building identities that were less dependent on the country their parents had lost. The community, therefore, faced a problem that could not be solved by politics alone. Even if Russia changed again, would everyone return? And if they did return, where exactly would they return to? The Russia of memory was the Russian Empire. The Russia that existed after the revolution was Soviet. The distinction was enormous. For an émigré, home could mean a landscape remembered from childhood rather than a political state that still existed. That is why the disappearance of the Kobe community cannot be explained by one event. It was a long process. First came displacement, then legal uncertainty, then adaptation, then political pressure, and finally, war and the post-war world would accelerate the process. The community had once been able to gather around shared memories. But memories do not pay rent. They do not provide passports. They do not guarantee safety. They do not stop families from moving when circumstances change. And as the years passed, the question became increasingly practical. Should a family remain in Kobe? Should it leave Japan? Should it seek a new country? Should it preserve a Russian identity or adapt to the society around it? There was no single answer. That is precisely why the community would eventually disappear as a distinct social world. Not because everyone vanished at once, but because one person left, another moved, another adapted, another family emigrated, and another institution lost the people who had once sustained it. The community's disappearance would therefore look less like an explosion and more like a slow emptying of a room. And after the Second World War, that emptying accelerated. The most difficult part of this story is also the part where the evidence requires the greatest discipline. The surviving research gives us a clear picture of the community as a whole, but the verified material available here does not provide enough securely documented biographies to invent four cinematic personal stories. So instead of putting fictional words into the mouths of refugees, we have to look at the lives that the evidence can actually support. The first human reality was work. Russian émigrés in Kobe were involved in itinerant and small-scale trade. That means survival was often connected to movement. A refugee did not necessarily arrive with a secure profession waiting for him. The old social hierarchy of Imperial Russia had been broken by revolution, civil conflict, displacement, and exile. In Kobe, the question was practical. What could you sell? Where could you go? How could you earn enough to remain independent? The second reality was religious identity. The Russian population of Kobe included Christians, Jews, and Muslim Tatars. That diversity is important because it shows that Russian did not describe a single religious culture. For some, Orthodox institutions could provide continuity. For Muslim Tatars, the mosque provided another form of community. The Kobe Muslim Mosque and the Kobe Eastern Orthodox Church Assumption of the Blessed Virgin, therefore, became more than buildings. They represented different ways of preserving identity in exile. The third reality was legal insecurity. After 1925, white Russians were treated as stateless. A Nansen Passport could identify them internationally, but it could not restore a lost citizenship. For someone trying to build a future, that distinction was enormous. You could live in Kobe for years and still occupy an uncertain legal position. The fourth reality was movement. Some white Russians were expelled from Japan during the 1920s. Later, after the Second World War, the community declined sharply as émigrés left Japan and dispersed internationally. This is where individual stories disappear into statistics. A person leaves, a family follows, a business closes, a religious institution loses members, a neighborhood becomes less Russian, then a generation grows up somewhere else. The research does not give us enough verified names, ages, occupations, and final destinations to reconstruct each of these lives safely. That absence is itself revealing. Historical exile often leaves incomplete records. The people who experienced it were not always famous generals or aristocrats. They were ordinary refugees whose lives rarely entered major historical narratives. And yet their disappearance was the mechanism through which the community disappeared. The tragedy was not necessarily one dramatic death. It was fragmentation. One family in another country. Another family assimilated. Another institution weakened. Another person unable to return. Another grave remaining behind. And then, decades later, you can still find physical evidence that they existed. A church, a mosque, a cemetery. But the society that once connected those places is gone. That is perhaps the most painful human detail of the entire story. A community can disappear without every individual disappearing. People survive. They marry. They work. They raise children. They move. They adapt. But the world they created together can still vanish. For the white Russians of Kobe, the Second World War created another layer of uncertainty. The community had already lived through revolution, exile, statelessness, political suspicion, and economic insecurity. Now the international environment was becoming even more dangerous. By the 1930s, some representatives of the white Russian community had developed stronger nationalist attitudes and had even donated to the Japanese government and military. At the same time, the community remained internally divided over attitudes toward the Soviet Union. That division mattered because the émigrés were living between competing political worlds. They had escaped the Soviet system, but they were also foreigners living in Japan. Japanese authorities had already watched the community closely, with particular concern about possible connections to foreign states. The result was a community that could not simply remain outside politics. Even refusing to choose could become a political position. And then, the war changed the meaning of movement. A port city is useful during peaceful times because it connects people and commerce. During war, those same connections can become dangerous. After the Second World War, the number of white Russians in Japan declined sharply. Many emigrated abroad. seeking to avoid the uncertainty and disruption of the post-war period. In Kobe, the Russian population began to shrink. Its organizations gradually weakened and disappeared. This is one of the most important facts in the entire story. The end did not come because a single government announced, "The Russian community of Kobe is finished." There was no single final moment. Instead, there was a sequence. People left. Families dispersed. Institution weakened. The community became smaller. And eventually, the social network that had made it possible to speak of a distinct white Russian society in Kobe ceased to function as it once had. The process was also connected to re-immigration. Former refugees did not necessarily stay in the country where they had first found safety. They moved again. Some went to other countries. Some gradually became part of new societies. The refugee who had once asked, "Where can I escape?" eventually had to ask a different question. Where can I finally remain? For some people, the answer was not Kobe. And there is another irony. The same international mobility that had helped Russian émigrés survive also helped dissolve the community they had built. A port connected people to the world. But connection also made departure possible. Kobe could be a refuge without becoming a permanent homeland. And when the community began to disperse after the war, its physical traces remained behind. The cemetery remained. The religious buildings remained. The memory remained. But the population that had given those places their everyday meaning was shrinking. The story of Kobe's White Russians was therefore entering its final stage. Not a final battle. Not a dramatic surrender. Something quieter. A community leaving one person at a time. The story of Kobe's White Russians is small compared with the scale of the Russian Revolution. More than 2 million refugees left the former Russian Empire. Kobe's peak white Russian population was more than 400. But numbers alone can be misleading. The significance of Kobe lies in what it reveals about the wider Russian diaspora. The collapse of an empire does not end when a government falls. It continues through the movement of people. Borders change. Citizenship changes. Political identities change. Families become separated from the places where their grandparents were born. And communities appear far beyond the territory where their culture originally developed. Kobe was one of those places. The Russian émigrés who reached Japan were part of a much larger transformation. The old Russian imperial world had disappeared. In its place stood new political realities. The Soviet Union existed where the Russian Empire had once ruled. The émigrés had to decide what that meant for their own identity. Some rejected the Soviet state. Some adapted to life abroad. Some developed stronger nationalist positions. Some eventually moved again. The international system also had to deal with people who no longer had a normal state identity. The Nansen Passport was one response to this problem. It was connected to the League of Nations and provided an international form of identification for stateless refugees. But a document could not reverse history. It could not recreate lost property. It could not restore a vanished social class. It could not guarantee that children would feel the same connection to a country their parents had left. That is why the Kobe story has a wider echo. Refugee communities can be remarkably resilient. They can build institutions. They can establish places of worship. They can create businesses. They can preserve languages and traditions. But they're also vulnerable to the ordinary forces of time. Children grow up. Families move. People marry outside the original community. Businesses close. Political conditions change. And eventually, the original refugee generation dies. What remains? Sometimes a building. Sometimes a cemetery. Sometimes a religious institution. Sometimes a family story passed down through generations. In Kobe, 3 physical reminders are particularly important. The Kobe Eastern Orthodox Church Assumption of the Blessed Virgin, the Kobe Muslim Mosque, and the Kobe Foreign Cemetery. These places demonstrate something that statistics cannot. The White Russians were not an abstract population. They occupied real streets. They prayed in real buildings. They buried their dead in real ground. They built lives in a city that was never supposed to be their homeland. And then the community changed until it no longer existed as the distinct social world it had once been. This is the historical echo. An empire can disappear in a few years. A diaspora can survive for decades. But even a diaspora has a lifespan. And when the people who created it begin to scatter, the question changes from where did they go to something more haunting. What remains when the people are gone? After the Second World War, the White Russian population of Japan declined sharply. Many émigrés left the country. Some families re-emigrated. Others became dispersed in new societies. The research describes this process as one of the reasons the former White Russian community of Kobe disappeared as a distinct social group. But disappearance does not mean that every individual disappeared. This distinction is essential. People survived. Families continued. Children grew up. Some descendants became part of societies far from the neighborhoods where their parents or grandparents had lived. The original community, however, could no longer reproduce itself in the same way. That is how immigrant societies often end. Not with the final day, with a change in proportions. At first, there are enough people who share the same language, memories, religion, and experience to sustain institutions. Then the number falls. The next generation has other opportunities. Families move, and the institutions that once seemed permanent become smaller. Eventually, the name remains in historical records, but the social world has changed beyond recognition. The surviving physical sites in Kobe are therefore especially important. The Kobe Eastern Orthodox Church Assumption of the Blessed Virgin remains a reminder of the Christian side of the community. The Kobe Muslim Mosque represents another part of the former Russian and Tatar presence. The Kobe Foreign Cemetery preserves the dead. Together, they reveal the diversity hidden inside the phrase White Russians. The community was never simply one political group. It contained different religious traditions and different attitudes toward the Soviet Union. It also contained people who adapted to the realities of life in Japan. That makes the history more human. Exile is rarely a straight line. A refugee can leave one country, settle in another, and eventually move again. A child can inherit a language without inheriting the political identity of the parent. A grandchild can know a family story without ever seeing the place where it began. And so, the descendants of Kobe's White Russians cannot be understood simply as Russians who remained abroad. Their identities could change across generations. The available research does not provide enough verified information to name particular descendants, give their occupations, or state precisely where each family ended up. Those details would require additional archival and genealogical research. But the larger trajectory is clear. The people who once made Kobe a center of White Russian life gradually dispersed. Their community organizations declined. Their neighborhoods lost their distinct Russian character. And the Russian presence survived primarily through institutions, graves, memories, and descendants rather than through a large, self-contained émigré society. There is a quiet tragedy in that. The refugees had wanted to survive. They did. But survival did not necessarily mean preserving the exact community they had built. Sometimes survival means changing so completely that the original community becomes difficult to recognize. And that leads to the final question. If a people preserve their lives, but lose the society that once connected them, have they lost their homeland twice? Today, the former white Russian community of Kobe is best understood not as a large surviving enclave, but as a historical presence preserved in places, institutions, family histories, and memory. The community itself disappeared as a distinct social society, but its physical traces did not disappear at the same speed. The Kobe Eastern Orthodox Church Assumption of the Blessed Virgin remains connected with the city's Russian Orthodox history. The Kobe Muslim Mosque preserves another part of the story, the presence of Muslim Tatars within the population that was broadly classified in Japan as White Russian. And the Kobe Foreign Cemetery preserves the most permanent evidence of all. The dead did not move when the living did. The cemetery remained. This is the strange final image of Kobe's Russian refugees. A community that once contained more than 400 people at its height eventually scattered. Some left Japan. Some re-emigrated. Some families became part of new societies. The organizations that had supported the community declined and disappeared. But the places remained. A church, a mosque, a cemetery. 3 different reminders that exile was not an abstract political event. It was lived by human beings. They arrived after the collapse of the Russian imperial world. They built lives in Japan. They worked in trade. They lived in neighborhoods. They worshipped according to different faiths. They faced statelessness after 1925. They lived under political suspicion. Some were expelled. Some adapted to the changing Japanese environment. And after the Second World War, many left again. The story, therefore, does not have a simple ending. There was no moment when every white Russian in Kobe suddenly vanished. The community dissolved through movement and time. And perhaps that is what makes the story so powerful. You can survive a revolution. You can survive exile. You can cross borders. You can learn another language. You can build another home. But you cannot always preserve the world that made you who you were. The universal lesson is simple. Sometimes the greatest loss is not losing your life, but surviving long enough to watch the world you belong to disappear. If you want more documentaries about the people who lived through the collapse of empires and were forced to rebuild their lives far from home, subscribe to the channel. These stories matter because they show what political upheaval looks like when it reaches ordinary human lives through documents, work, family, faith, migration, and memory. And here is the question worth carrying with you. If survival required abandoning the community that preserved your identity, would you choose to stay true to the past or choose the future? The White Russians of Kobe did not simply lose a country. They lost a world, and decades later, the buildings and graves left behind may be the only witnesses that the world was ever there.